We are in a civilizational crisis. I mean, often, of course, everybody recognizes we're in this climate crisis. But as Greta often say, you know, we're telling ourselves some bedtime stories to soothe ourselves. The reality of what we are seeing at this moment is beyond actually what is largely communicated, right? I worked on many years at the UNFCCC and the UN Climate Convention, and helped set up the global climate justice movement as an alternative and a rejection actually of environmentalism of the global north, which talked about climate as being an issue about reducing carbon, where for the climate justice movement, particularly from the global south, climate was an issue about reducing injustice. It was an expression of other existing inequalities, that climate framed and fanned all of the existing inequalities and injustices that are woven through society. But we are all now, don't need to be a climate scientist, right? We know, we can see, every time you turn on your television, we see the killer floods, droughts, famines, pretty much everywhere, happening everywhere in the world. But the scale of them, of course, is quite unprecedented. So one single storm on the island of Dominica can wipe out development gains of 10 years. So that's about minus 240% of its GDP. As one storm in Mozambique can leave a whole population on the brink of starvation, not because of the storm itself, but because the state is unable to protect its own citizens because it's paying more of its money in debt repayments to banks and corporations in the global north. And if you remember, Mozambique had to come to the city of London and beg for more debt-creating loans as a response to that one single storm. I'm originally from Pakistan. I was born in Pakistan. You all probably saw one storm, one flood, covered a third of the country. That's just one extreme event. And at the same time, the irony for Pakistan, we have temperatures of 53.5 degrees centigrade, where the government says that the only answer is to dig mass graves, because 4 out of 10 people face multiple dimensional poverty, where they're barely surviving. This is not people who, oh, well, let's get some air conditioning. These are people who have to work out in the fields, have to make and work to be able to make enough to be able to survive each and every day. So they have no choice. And we saw, whether it's in Sindh, in Karachi, thousands of people dying from heat. So we're faced with this moment, and yet it's all happening at just over 1 degree centigrade. These were things that we were told, the scientists told us, would never occur until we breached the 2 degrees target. We're now, most scientists will tell you that maybe we're technically not past 1.5, but politically we're past 1.5. This was not a goal. This was the guardrail. We said we would never breach because of what it meant to our systems, the very systems that we all rely on. Most climate scientists would say we're probably about 5 years from breaching 1.5, probably another 2 decades in the current emissions trajectory from breaching 2 degrees. And by the end of the century, we'll be close to 3 degrees. So a child born now, that's only 75 years. In 75 years, we'll be at 3 degree planet. And 2 degrees, if we remember, is when our food systems start to collapse and start to unravel. In places like the Indian subcontinent, South Asia, which hosts like 3 billion people, that means collapses in rice and wheat production. And so the scale of this, of course, is unprecedented. And it's happening in a world which is already riven with deep inequalities. We have a crisis of inequality. We have half the world, still 3.5 billion people, surviving on the equivalent of $5.50. Right? That's just barely surviving. If you wanted that, World Bank itself will say, if you wanted somebody to live with dignity, you don't need at least minimum of $10. If you actually wanted them to genuinely live as not our kind of consumer lifestyle, they need about $15 a day. We've got close to 1 billion people struggle to feed themselves each and every day. Yet we produce food that can feed the world 3 times over. And we bury a third of that food that's produced because we have an industrial food system that ridiculously prioritizes moving and producing food for the consumption of the global north. Countries like Kenya, which is a massive food producer, produces and exports about 75 to 80% of its food. to be able to import 90% of its food, because countries are locked into commodity dependency. If you looked at the maps of colonial Africa or colonial Asia and saw what was being produced for the countries of the global north, and then look now, it's exactly the same commodities on the same pathways. Yes, we might have gunships and the Raj there, but actually our trade rules, our debt rules, our tax rules impose the same inequalities and injustices. You know, you probably heard that very famous sort of estimate that Britain during the British Raj, just from the Indian subcontinent alone, by the time it left, when it came to India, India's share of global GDP was about 24%. When it left, it was less than 4%, and it had taken 45 trillion pounds out of the Indian subcontinent alone. Out of the Indian subcontinent, not out of Africa, not out of the Caribbean. It said that Britain never spent a single pound of its own money on its colonial expansion and expansion to the new colonies, etc. And that's not a historic matter. If you look at now and listen to Piketty, the famous French economist, just released a new study. But if you look at the scale of wealth that flows still from the global south to the global north, it's incredible. Estimated for every single dollar that flows from the north to the south, something like $24 flows the other way in either illicit capital flows, in profits, in tax avoidance, etc. So we are faced with a world of just deep injustices. And of course, at the same time, our ecosystems are very collapsing. The very system in which all govern our water, our food, everything. We are killing more species each and every year. And this is all happening because, of course, we've created a world which of excessive consumption and extraction and exploitation. We have a logic that goes back 500 years that says certain parts of the world and certain people can be sacrificed. You know, if we had time, I would say look at the doctrine of discovery, and you see the same logic of doctrine of discovery to this day that says some people, everybody's human, but some people's lives are worth a little bit more, and we all can see that. When we look at how our government is responding to what's happening in Ukraine and what it happens to in Palestine, we can see whose lives matter more in this lens. And so in this moment of like profound crisis, this question about, you know, climate migration, climate displacement, climate refugees, all of these has been very, very central to the climate justice movement. And in a lot of our discussions, we've begun to frame, as Antonio said, on what would be the right to move, but also what's the right not to move. Yeah, what does that look like? Because let's be honest, the reality of the global north, accepting displacement of mass displacement of people from the global south is just not realistic, and it's not possible. We know that the overwhelming majority of people who are displaced either internally into poor countries or into their neighbour countries. A very, very small number of people ever make it to the global north. And of course, we know, as we've heard, we're all living through this moment of like far-right fascism, populism, where migration has been weaponized, and it's a language of walls and fences. In that conversation, I suppose, of looking at that depressive sort of thought, I think there is some hope, because incredibly, if you look at what the IPCC, so the IPCC is the world's climate scientists, every 5 years, they get together and they produce this incredible, massive report. One part of it is on the science of like how bad everything is, and usually it's like everything we predicted is even worse than what we predicted, and but it's like amazing. And then the second part is all about what do we do? And in it, you see that when people now talk about adaptation, right, they no longer talk about build seawalls, right? They no longer talk about that. They say what is required is public services, social protection, living wages. They say that the reason there's vulnerability 14 times greater in the global south than in the global north is because people lack these basic things. This is what determines how you experience extreme climate violence. And we know that these extreme weather events are now happening in the global north. But we saw the capacity, the different capacity. When Pakistan had its flood, literally the following year, if you remember, Germany had a flood and just affected 2 of its states. Germany spent 30 billion euros on ensuring that flood never happened and supporting those affected people. It was only about, I think it was about 200 and something people died, and of course thousands of people were affected, but nowhere close to the millions of people, 30 million people that were affected in Pakistan, who lost absolutely everything. And Pakistan had to go to the IMF to ask for another debt-creating loan of another 10, 15 billion dollars to be able to deal with that. So your ability to be able to navigate this moment, of course, depends on where you are, right? So how do we in this moment think about this? Now, often people say, well, you know, the far right, they're climate deniers. And, you know, this is all tied into their climate denialism. Actually, I think it's really interesting because, of course, there is a part of the far right which is climate deniers, but there's a lot of the far right who are not climate deniers, who actually use our arguments about climate displacement to justify the walls and fences. They say, see, this is what's happening. The world is unraveling. There are going to be hundreds of millions of these black and brown people at our door. The only answer is we look after ourselves. We need walls and fences. We need securitization.